Every once in a while, I like to open up EmberMap's codebase and look for some outdated patterns. You know, it's funny how code from just a year ago can feel really dated. Well, I was doing that recently and found an opportunity to extract a new component, and I want to walk through that with you today. So I'm running EmberMap's front end locally here, and you'll see it doesn't look exactly like EmberMap's homepage right now because we are just using some dummy data here. But all the basic structure is just the same. Now, what I want to work on today is, I can just make this smaller, the fixed aspect ratio of these images right here. So if I come to the top and just zoom out and refresh, you'll see that the structure of the page doesn't move when the images load. And I can actually simulate that by slowing down these images. So if I come to the Ember inspector here and find my component inspector, we can see that this row right here is something called the list of clips bookshelf. Then we have a spacer here, and then we have a series bookshelf, another spacer, and then we have a list of series bookshelf. So we have this bookshelf concept on the home page that's actually displaying all of these things. And in the list of clips bookshelf right here, we see that each one of these cards is actually a clip card component, which is basically just a UI card that can render a clip. So if I come over to my editor and pop open the clip card template, here we see the template, and we can search for image. And this is where the actual poster for this particular clip is being rendered. So this is using our UI image component, which is kind of just like a primitive low-level component, which basically just renders an image tag and does a few other things. So what I'm going to do is come down here. This UI image takes in a source, as we can see right here. And so to kind of slow it down, I'm just going to use did receive adders. I'm going to grab that source. I'm going to import later. And I'll wait about 1,000 milliseconds. I'll clear the source. And then we'll go ahead and reset that source to what was passed in. And I'm just going to do this to delay the image. Let's bump this up to 1,500 milliseconds. So if we come back and take a look, now we see that everywhere that UI image component is used, which is basically everywhere, we kind of have this delay. But you'll notice that the page doesn't flash. Those images don't actually affect the flow of the document. And that's because we're using this fixed aspect ratio concept that sets aside room in the DOM for all these posters. Now you may have seen back in our clip card template that I'm passing this AR into UI image. And AR stands for aspect ratio, and that's exactly what this parameter is for. So by passing this in, this is going to say, hey, I'm expecting an image that's 16 by 9. Go ahead and set aside that space for me so that when the image comes in, it doesn't adjust my document. So let's see what happens if I go ahead and take this away. So there we see the initial page renders, and then all of the images come in and push the whole document down. And if you're down here, kind of scroll down, it's particularly noticeable because all these posters are pushing the content down. So it's a much nicer experience when you set that room aside. And if your images happen to take a long time to load, you know, all this text isn't going to reflow on the screen. So the refactoring I want to talk about today is how this is actually implemented. And we can see here, if we come and actually look at the UI image component, we kind of have a placeholder here that indicates you can pass this in. And then in our template, we say, if there is an aspect ratio provided, here's what the implementation looks like. So we have a wrapper div with AR dash whatever we passed in, and then we render our image tag, and that image tag has a class of AR content. So basically all of the logic around this is built into these classes. So let's go ahead and just do a search for AR content. And right here we can see it used in a few different places, but right here we see it defined. And this actually comes from tachyons, which is a CSS library we used to use to style Ember map before we changed over to Tailwind. But we had these concepts baked into some of these components, and so I just copied these over to this ext.scss file. So my goal with this refactoring is basically to refactor these into a component so I can blow this thing away from the code base. So the way that this works, as we saw in the UI image template, is that we need kind of two elements. We need a parent that has an AR dash and then some aspect ratio class. In our case, we were using 16:9, so we were applying these rules. And then the actual content has this AR content class. And that's true regardless of the actual aspect ratio we're using. So the trick is basically this padding bottom calculation. We can see with 16:9, it's 56.25, and that comes from 9 divided by 16. You can see that's 0.5625. For 1:1, it's 100%. And then we have this other kind of funny ratio, which we use for these featured sections up here. So if we look at this clip card right here, we see that this is using 16:9. And I can just do a quick find for 16:9. And I can see it used in a couple other areas of the site. So in the actual video hero, we can see we have this AR 16:9 and AR content class, which is kind of mixed with this other stuff. And that's if you actually go to watch a video, it's the same idea. We know that this video is going to take 16:9 space here. So when I reload this, as that video loads, it's not going to reflow the document. We can also see it being used in the video card, the video player, and a few other places. And so this is really a perfect use case for a component. I think if I were building this for the first time today, I would definitely encapsulate this behavior in a component that could compose with these things like UI image, so I didn't have to add all these APIs like AR equals. If we have this in a component that works with UI image or a video player or anything, then we don't have to worry about adding new APIs. We can just compose it with our existing templates. So what might that look like? Well, I think right here, let's say we just had an aspect ratio component, and that took a ratio, and maybe we specified this as 16:9. And that way we wouldn't need this. And if this component was responsible for making sure its entire block contents was contained within a 16:9 container, then UI image wouldn't even have to know that it's being presented in this container at all. So this is what I want to make right now. So let's get started. I'm going to save this. And let's go back to the home page. Okay, we don't see much of anything, and that's because this component doesn't exist. So I'm going to go ahead and generate an aspect ratio component. So the default component is actually rendering all the content, but as we saw, it's obviously not doing anything with the aspect ratio. And since we took away that AR option, these images are also not being rendered according to that aspect ratio. So let's come look here again. And I'm just going to copy this, pop open our aspect ratio template, paste this, and let's start by just making this work with the 16:9. Now previously we put this AR content class right on the image, but this really just needs to be on the immediate child of this parent. And we want to make this generic. So I'm going to change this to a div. Get rid of that. Get rid of this. Save that. And there we go. Our aspect ratio component is already working for the 16:9 case. So that's pretty cool. Now, one thing here, if I pop open the inspector, here we see the AR 16:9 class, and here we see the content. And then we also have this parent div, which is the Ember component. We see that Ember ID right there. Now, typically when I'm making components like this, I've started to make these tagless components just because I like doing as much work as possible in the template here, and there's no need for that extra div. I basically want to minimize the chance that this component is going to affect some other part of the layout. So let's go ahead and make this tagless. Refresh here. Everything still looks good. And now we just have those two divs. Okay, next thing I want to do is, I've actually started using the angle bracket components. This is an awesome new feature that landed in Ember 3.4. So if we just change this to aspect ratio, and save this, everything still works. So that's really nice. I really like the way this looks. Now, arguments to angle brackets are actually prefixed with an @ sign. So this is how we're going to actually pass in this ratio. And while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and change this. I'm going to write this like this with a colon instead of an X, because I think that's the more common way to express aspect ratios whenever you're talking about images or videos or anything like that. So this is really the API I want to end up with. Now let's go ahead and use this on these components up here, which come from the featured series card. So I'll pop open featured series card template. Here we see that aspect ratio on the image. So if we remove that, 3413, and come here and change this to 3413, now we can see that there's all this extra room here because there's too much space being set aside for these. So now let's go and actually implement this ratio param and make it work for our component. So what I'm going to do is open up that ext file again and see here that all of these classes have the position relative on them. So the first step is to just replace this with relative. And that's the Tailwind class for adding relative here. But because we don't have the rest of it, now we see everything's kind of screwed up. So the rest of it is to calculate this padding bottom based on the passed in aspect ratio. And the way I'm going to do this is using a computed property for an inline style. So back in the component, I'm going to import computed, define a style property, and this is basically going to return that styling that we're missing. So padding bottom, and again we can just hard code this for now. And there we see we have that 16:9 space set aside again. Now if we look at our console, we see that binding style attributes may introduce cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. So what we want to do here is also import HTML safe and just return this string using HTML safe function. And this is just going to make sure that the content we're passing in here is trusted content. And because it's just coming from us, we know it is trusted in this case. So there we go, we got rid of that warning. And now we can get back to actually making this thing work. So with aspect ratio, we're passing in this ratio argument. So I'll just put ratio here to indicate that this can be passed in. And the example use is aspect ratio equals 16:9. And then your content goes here. So what we want to do is actually calculate this 56.25 percentage number from the ratio. So if we get the ratio, it's going to be 16:9. We can split it by colon. This is going to give us an array of strings, something like 16,9. So we want to map these to numbers. So I'm just going to use this unary operator to coerce these two numbers. So now we have 16 and 9. And to get the quotient of these two numbers from this array, we can actually use reduce. And reduce will actually iterate over this array. It takes a function starting with the previous number and then iterating over the current number. So in this case, pre would be 16 and current would be 9. And remember, 56.25 comes from 9 divided by 16. So that means we actually want to return current over previous. Let's throw this in a variable called padding bottom and just throw a debugger in here and see what this looks like. Padding bottom. Okay, it says 0.38, but I think if we look at ratio, we see that this is actually 3413. And if we advance, now we see we have 56.25, and now we're looking at a 16:9. So it seems like we're actually doing this right. So to get from 0.5625, which is the actual percentage here, to 56.25, we want to go ahead and multiply this by 100, and then we'll just add a percentage sign to this. So I'm just going to replace this right here with the padding bottom times 100. Save that, come back, refresh. And there we go. Now it looks like the perfect amount of space is actually set aside here. And we can see here that this parent wrapper has the relative class, but it also has this inline styling of padding bottom of 38%, whereas these have padding bottom of 56.25. So now when I refresh, even though the images are delayed, nothing is reflowing in the document. So that's really cool. We now have this composable aspect ratio component. It takes in a ratio and basically presents its contents contained inside that ratio. Now lastly, I'm pretty happy with this implementation, except we're still using this kind of one-off AR content class, which comes from this original file here. So now that we're using Tailwind, I'd really like this to be more aligned with the way you do things in Tailwind. So if I just copy this stuff over here so I can see it as a reference, this should just become absolute. Now we have a height and width of 100. So if I pop open my height module here, we've got a width of full for 100%. So width full and height full, that's the Tailwind defaults for 100% there. And then when it comes to setting the 0 parts of all of these options, I'll just pop open the Tailwind docs. And these are called pinning edges. And we have some utilities that Tailwind gives us for pinning to the top or the right. In our case, we want to just pin the entire thing. So we get to just use this pin utility. So I'll just throw pin on here. That gets rid of these. And then this z index of 100, I'm not really sure why this is on here, but I don't think that actually matters. So I'm just going to delete that. And now we've just got Tailwind classes here, as well as our computed style property. So let's see if this works. And it seems like it did. Pretty cool. Let's try our new aspect ratio component in one other place. So I'll search for the 16:9 again. And here in the UI video hero, we use it right here. So this shows if the video is coming soon. So let's see if we can find a video that is coming soon. Over here in videos, on this acceptance test kind of mock data, here we go. We have a coming soon video. So we see that it leaves space here. So it looks like a video is showing. I'll go ahead and delete this old 16:9 class and this AR content class. And we should see this collapse now. Okay, so now we don't have that space set aside. But we should be able to basically replace this with our new aspect ratio component, which takes in a ratio. This one is 16:9. And we'll just close that off. Okay, so it looks like we do have some space set aside because this black background here is taking up what looks to be the right amount of space, but our message here is not. And if we look, we can see that this is a flex item, and this parent right here, which is the child of our new component, is what's taking up this space. And as we just saw, we have this implemented with absolute width of full and height of full. And because we used to have that AR content class right here, and we can actually add that back, that AR content was doing all of this stuff as well. Importantly, it was setting the width and height to be full. Think if we want a child like this that doesn't have enough content by default to fill up the container, we should just be able to throw a width of full and a height of full on it. And if we do, we should get back to what we had before. So now this child is filling up this container, and then it's using Flex to lay out all of this content inside of its block. So this is something that we'll sometimes have to add if the child wants to fill up the whole space, but we no longer have to worry about the details of the ratio. That's all taken care of by this. So if we wanted to change this to 4:3, we should just be able to change this here. And now we have a video hero that is 4:3. This message is still centered. So this is still really a great abstraction that we're going to be able to get a lot of use out of. And even better, once I go through and remove all of the uses of this AR parameter to this UI image component, we'll be able to delete this argument and this entire block of template here from this component. Because as we saw in our clip card template, our new aspect ratio component composes really well with things like images that take up a lot of space. So I just wanted to take that time to show you off this really cool aspect ratio component. I think these days I'm much more inclined to make these small single purpose kind of utility components just because they compose so well with other parts of the system. And they make it so I can use them with images or videos without having to modify the UI image or the video classes or components that I'm already using. So This is a great example of composability, and it looks pretty sharp with these new angle bracket components as well.